Hello and welcome back to the Reapers, and we hope you're doing very well. So we're doing the second video in our series of 3, looking at the max sustained lateral turn rate of fighters. This one is the light fighter, so it's the F-18C versus the Mirage 2000C versus the Mig-29G. So what we're going to do, I've explained the how we're going to run this experiment in video 1, so if you want to know how we're doing it, go and watch that. I'll just talk you through it as I do it though in this Hornet. Stand by. I'm going to get down to 300 knots. I'm on the deck. I'm going to be turning, and I'm going to turn my G overrider on. Full power now. Turn tight as I dare. 300, and now I'm going to slowly ease off the back stick. Let the power up. Let the speed up very slowly. And I want to slowly explore the envelope between 300 knots TAS or calibrated and 300 and 500 knots, and I'm going to do that for each aeroplane. So that's 340, 350, 360, 370, 380, about to crash, 390. 400, 410, and the G limiter is working. Yes, it's working. 410, 4. Going down again now, but that's okay. We can repeat ourselves a little bit. It's not a problem. The more data we've got, the better. Right, let's get that speed back up again. 410, 420, 430, slow down, slow down, slow down. It's quite hard to control, so I'm going to have to jump between 400 and 500 in a bit. It's 500 there. Let's get that speed back down now. I'm going to have to let off the power a bit here. Go down to 400. It doesn't matter if we're not doing it linearly and smoothly as such, as long as we've got the data to record. So limiter off. Let's punch the speed up, punch the G up. Or 40. 450, and we're starting to struggle with G load now. 460, 470, 480, 490, and 500. Right, I'm happy we've got the data there. So I've explored all of the sustained turn rates, or as near as between 300 and 500 knots calibrated, and now we're going to do the same in the other two jets. Then we'll take the data through to TACView and study it and see what we can get from it. So stand by for that. Okay, hello and welcome back. So it's a little bit harder than I thought it was going to be for each fighter to actually get in doing the experiment. And again, if you want to know what I'm doing, please watch video 1, and so I don't have to repeat exactly what we're doing in this experiment. But yeah, it was quite hard to do it, to sustain and to move from 300 to 500 knots in a linear fashion while pulling max G. It's quite difficult. It took a bit of practice. I spent about an hour trying it several times with each aircraft, and I've chosen the best runs, if you like. So let's look at the Mirage first. Let's send it on its way. So here we've got data, and let's see what data we've got. We've got interesting data that we've got is true airspeed. That's what we're going to be using. G is going to be quite useful. Be nice if I could isolate these things. Can I move them? No, I can't move them. G is going to be useful. Turn rate there in degrees per second. And that's all I'm really interested in at the moment. Okay, so let's send him on his way. Wait till the experiment starts. So true speed's going to get down to about 300 or so. There it goes. Experiment is now starting. Let's start it at 1-to-1 speed. So let's watch just a second. So turn rate is there. So we're going to see when that peaks as we move from speed 300 to 500. Okay, G, we want to be maxing it out as much as possible, but it is going to vary because the reality is my stick is moving back and forward all the time. Turns out it's harder to do this than I thought it was going to be. Let's see what we've got. Right, turn rate and G speed. Right, I've just realised that I could add the turn rate here. So we've got G speed there, turn rate there, and G there. So it's going to be easy if we look there. So off he goes. 16 degrees per second at 290 knots. 18 degrees per second at 300 knots. 19 degrees per slowing down. Speeding up again. 70 degrees at 310 knots. 320 knots, 17 degrees per second. 330 knots, 16 degrees per second. And that's because probably my inaccuracies are flying rather than the aircraft. Turn rate should adjust. Well, I don't know. Let's just see what happens. It seems to be bottoming out here at about 16, 17 degrees per second. We're up to 360 knots. 370 knots, 16 degrees per second. 18 degrees per second, 380 knots. 20 degrees per second at 370 knots. .400 knots, 17 degrees per second. 430, 17 degrees per second. 440, 17 degrees per second. We're maxing out here much less than I thought it would be. Is that my flying or is it something experiment? Our G load's fairly high, 7.6 G. We really want to optimise that at 9 G, but the reality is it's incredibly hard to keep pulling exactly 9 G and watching the speed, keeping it moving in a linear fashion. And 8G, yeah, I mean in a real fight you're not going to be able to sustain 9G because you pass out. 480 knots, 18 degrees per second. .8G, 18 degrees per second, 500 knots. Just below about 8G and unload. And is that all I did? Quickly speed that up. That is literally all I did. So let's roll back there. We did have a peak of about 20 degrees per second there at 380 knots. Now, interestingly, that's actually when I had the lowest amount of G-force, when I thought the optimum turn rate was going to be based on the highest amount of G-force, so that's interesting. And the alpha, let's have a look at the alpha. The alpha is historically high at that point. So at the historically high bit of alpha, we've got to 20. So the highest we got there was 20 at 20 degrees per second at 7G at 380 knots TAS on the deck. Okay, I thought it would be better than that, and this was, how do I describe it? I guess this is what I would call real flying. You know, I was really flying by the seat of my pants. I was doing the best I could not to pass out and sustain a certain turn. So I think it is accurate, although it maybe doesn't show the absolute momentary maximum of the aircraft. I think in a sustained turn it's relatively accurate. So we've got the Mirage there as 20 degrees per second at 380 TAS. Okay, right, let's go to our next fighter. Right, off we go in the Mig-29G. Now, the reason I've changed the G, I mean, there's the A, the G, and the S available in DCS World. I've chosen the G because it displays in knots, and it was just easier for me not to have to do the conversion in my head between kilometers an hour and knots. There are some weight differences between A, G, and S, but they're relatively minimal. I think it's about 1,500 pounds difference over the model, something like that. It's not a huge amount, so I think this is going to be decent data. Right, so in we go. We're just going to get ourselves down to we're looking here, remember, about 300 knots. Not doing very well at the moment. Down we go again. It's hard to do because I'm balancing aft stick G and trying to linearly modulate TAS. So I'm going to keep making excuses, but I found it really hard to do. Right, we're not going to find our super turn rate in this limit, so 290, so 17 degrees at 300 knots. 18 degrees at 310 knots. G-load low, but we're going slow, so that's excusable. 18 degrees. It already looks higher turn rate than the Mirage. Still low G-force, low speed, 330 knots, 18 degrees per second, 340 knots, 18 degrees per second, 350 knots, 18 degrees per second, 19 degrees per second, nice at 350 knots, so 350 knots, 19 degrees per second, 360 knots, 18 degrees per second, 370 knots, 19 degrees per second, 380 knots, 19 degrees per second, 20 degrees per second at 380 knots, G-force 6G. 400 knots, down to 15. That must be a low momentary lack of G. I think I cocked up a bit here there. Just see how that radius just suddenly really jumped, and that was me unloading the G unwittingly, and look how much it destroys our turn rate. Now I did notice that when I was flying, so at this point I am going to let it back down to 300 and try and skip up again. You let it stick out just slightly too much, you lose your maximum G. And we'll keep watching anyway. 80 degrees per second, 500 knots, 8G, 9G, 23 degrees per second, but I'd call that a blip. You just couldn't sustain 9.3 G in a turn. You're fully black screen at that point. So 23 degrees per second, I think we're going to discount that. Right, so building our way up again because of that error. Hopefully we won't see such a large spike in turn radius. It gets quite difficult, the G model at this point. Right, we're at 400 knots, 17 degrees per second. 20 degrees per second, 410 knots. That looks like a peak. Unloaded the G a little. G going back up, 70 degrees per second, 460 knots. 480 knots, 17 degrees per second, 490. Oh, that's a bit ugly. 20 degrees per second, 500 knots. Unloading again. Looks like I'm going to try it again. Try again. 400. Loading up. Massive spike there. 9G at 25 degrees per second, but again, you can't maintain that at that speed. It's not sustainable. So, 90 degrees, 400 knots. 420 knots, 90 degrees per second. 420 knots, sustained, 8G, 21 degrees per second. Or was that a spike? It may have been a spike. 21 degrees, 21, yeah, this is faster. I think this is faster than the Mirage turn rate. 22 degrees per second, and that was bouncing from 2021, 22, 430 knots. Unloaded slightly, 18 degrees per second, 430, 440 knots. 20 back up again, 22 degrees per second, 450 knots, 21 degrees per second. The numbers are almost superfluous at this point. What we really need is a graph. If anyone out there has time in their lives to turn this into a graph, it would be so much better data. Because one thing I've learned from just watching this, it's like a power curve of a car engine. The peak isn't really that important. It's really a graph area that we're interested in. If you like an envelope optimal area. For 8 knots, 20 degrees per second. 498 over 8G, and I've unloaded at 20 degrees per second. So we were peaking, but sustaining. But we were sustaining just over 8G at about 450 knots, at about 21. I think 22 is a blip. I think we're sustaining 21 for enough time as proof of concept that we could sustain 450 knots at 21 degrees per second turn rate. And that's that, I guess. Right, let's go look at Mr. Hornet, shall we? And that was at 450 knots. Okay. Right, and finally onto the Hornet. I'm expecting this, because of its straighter wings, to be best turn rate, optimal turn rate at lower speed, but I don't know shit, so let's go and have a look, shall we? Send him on his way. Right, get down to 300 knots. start slightly high. 320 knots. Oh wow, that's high. 18 degrees per second. .330 knots, 17 degrees per second. 40 knots, 18 degrees per second. 350 knots, 20 degrees per second. Pretty good sustain there. 350 knots, 20 degrees per second. This plane was just easier to fly in general, I found. G load is low, but it's because our speed is low. We literally can't load on that G because of the high alpha and drag. But that is good so far. 350 knots, 20 degrees per second. .370 knots, 19 degrees per second, 20 degrees per second, 380 knots. Good envelope, this aircraft. 390 knots, 19 degrees per second. It's definitely turning. It's turning better than the Mirage and the Mig. It hasn't got the power to wait, I don't think. But the wings, it's just turning better with the wings. It's maintaining nearly 20 degrees through a good envelope of 350 to 400. The Mirage and the Mig were kind of bouncing 16, 17, 18, 19 at this point, where this was turning. It's just turning. You can just feel it was turning better. 80 degrees per second, 410 knots, 420 knots, 19 degrees per second. It's got to be a blip. It's because I've blipped up to 8G here. 22 degrees per second. I don't think that's going to be sustainable. Maybe it is. Yep, I'm sustaining 22 degrees per second at 420 knots. Wow. So that is a new class leader at 8.3G. That is sustainable. Just. Yeah, it is. 21 degrees per second. 420 knots. I'm kind of bouncing around this 420 knots area. Again, we're sustaining 22 degrees per second there. It was a little bit. 22 degrees per second, 400 knots. Lovely. That's a tight turner. We're going down a bit now. Again, it doesn't matter if I don't go up all the time. I can go up and then down and up again, as long as I try and sustain these different speeds. Oh, you can see I've suddenly unloaded the plane there as I've increased the radius. I'll probably correct that and start going back down now. Let's see what happens. 18 degrees per second. We're getting, it's struggling a bit more with these higher speeds, but it's still good. Still 19. Now I know why I struggle so much against it in an F-15. 20 knots, sustained 500. Yeah, it's just good at turning by the looks of it. I'm surprised how weak the Mig-29 was. Actually, I really thought. I guess it just hasn't got the wing design for turn rate. Let's see anyway. Right, we're back down to 400 knots. I've spotted that I've cocked up, and here we go again. Loading up. Loaded up. 21 sustained. .19 degrees, 450 knots. 20 degrees per second, 460 knots. Good sustain here. That's as much as I can hold without blacking out. HE 480 knots, 18 degrees per second. And we're up to 500 knots, 19 degrees per second. I think that's what we're going to get. That's got good data there. And like I said, I'd done several practice runs in each plane. I spent about an hour practicing to get that right, so it was hard to do. But I think that's as good as we're going to get. And if that's as good as we can get in a test, then that's better than we're going to get in a dogfight. So, in a real dogfight. So I think this is, although it's not perfect, it's pretty good data. Okay, now let's find our peak. Our best sustain, I felt, was here. Sorry, here at 350 knots. No, 400 knots. Let's go check that 350 again. 350, no, 350, I couldn't get above 20. So the myth of the Hornet turning at 350 knots is wrong. It's wrong. It's 400 knots where it's turning. Or above 400 knots, and I've lost it now. 420 knots is where we got our peak. 8.2 G of load, and it was sustaining at 22 degrees. So, 420, TAS, 8.2, turn rate 22. Right, I'm going to collate that and get back to you with the final conclusion. Right, and then we have the final results. So, the Mirage 2000C, we felt, looking at the data, sustained its best turn at 380 knots true airspeed with a turn rate of 20 degrees per second. It will be interesting to see how that compared to the real life Mirage results, bearing in mind that we do have half a tank of gas here, so they're always going to be slightly less than the real fighters, than the real life planes, because they do it with absolute minimal gas. I'm doing it here with half gas because half a fuel of gas. Why? Because I just feel that's more relevant, basically. Okay, Mig-29 Golf. I found its best sustained turn rate. I haven't got the G-force in here, but you might as well just. They're all going to be about 8G. 450 knots true airspeed at 21 degrees per second of turn rate, and the best was the F-18C at its peak sustained lateral turn rate at 420 knots true airspeed, 22 degrees per second. Okay, so those are some interesting. So what can we take from this? That the F-18 is basically the tighter turner at that particular speed. That it's probably false of the rumours that it turns best at 350 knots, at least with half a tank of gas. It appears we've proved it to ourselves with a couple of runs, or actually several runs, that 22 degrees is the best at 420. So it's actually a relatively fast turner rather than the low speed turner that we thought. The MiG, with its very swept back wings, gets its maximum turn rate of 450 knots, so very fast. I was kind of expecting that, and I would expect that with the F-15 as well. When we run the heavy fighters, I bet the F-15 gets 450 knots. It just seems to favour kind of 45 degree, 50 degree wing sweep there. And the Delta, I don't know anything about Delta aerodynamics, so I don't know why 380 knots it would have peaked. Someone smarter than me has to explain that. Okay, now like I said, these are peak values, so they do have their use, because we know that if we're in a dogfight now and the F-18, we want to turn at 420 knots. But what I think is going to be more useful, looking at power graph, for instance, from a car engine, is actually the curve. So if someone went through my video, someone had time and energy on their hands, went through my video and took every 10 knots, they read my values and they plotted it as a curve with G as a line, with turn rate as a line, with speed as an axis, and then we can compare the curves on a same graph. I think the curve, and that gives us a curve performance envelope curve. I think that would be more interesting. So if anyone's willing to do that, get the graphics back to me on Discord or something, then I'll make a movie and put it out to everyone and give my own reading on that. We can work together. Right, I hope that was useful. It's certainly useful for me, actually. I've really enjoyed doing that. It took a lot of time, but I enjoyed doing that. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll do the heavy fighters next, and we'll see you later.